The cross was not a Christian invention. Before it ever hung on a wall or a necklace, it was a Roman deterrent. It was a device Rome used to terrify conquered peoples into submission, planted on hills outside city walls, where every traveler entering the gates would see exactly what happened to people who defied the empire. And the man executed on it, on a Friday afternoon outside the walls of Jerusalem, was killed using the precise method Rome reserved for slaves, pirates, and rebels. Not for ordinary criminals, for the lowest of the low, and for anyone who dared to threaten Roman order. That single fact should stop you, because it means the central event of the Christian faith did not happen in a vacuum. It happened inside a machine. A vast, brutal, remarkably efficient Roman machine that taxed, occupied, conscripted, and crucified. And that machine is not a footnote to the Gospels. It is running quietly underneath almost every page, open to nearly any chapter in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, and Rome is there. It is there in the tax collector sitting at his booth. It is there in the coin passed from hand to hand in the temple courts. It is there in the census that puts a pregnant woman on a donkey heading toward Bethlehem. It is there in the title over the cross, written in Latin, Greek, and Aramaic, so that no one passing by could misunderstand who was really in charge. Most of us read past all of it. We treat it as background scenery, the way you might ignore the furniture in a photograph because you are looking at the people. But once you start seeing Rome, you cannot stop seeing it. And once you see it, the Gospels read like an entirely different story. Not just a story about faith. A story about what it costs to live under a power you did not choose, and what it means when God chooses to enter that exact situation instead of avoiding it. To understand what that cost actually looked like, we have to go back further than Jesus. We have to go back nearly a century, to the year Rome first marched into Jerusalem. In 63 BC, a Roman general named Pompey led his legions into Judea and settled a civil war between two rival brothers fighting over the Jewish high priesthood. Pompey did not simply mediate. He walked into the temple itself, into the Holy of Holies, the one room in the entire Jewish world where only the high priest was permitted to enter, and only once a year. Historians record that Pompey looked around, found no idol, no image of a god the way Roman temples typically held, and walked back out unimpressed. But the violation was already complete. From that day forward, Judea existed inside Rome's orbit. It would never again be fully independent. From that point on, Roman soldiers were a fixture of the landscape, not a rumor. Garrisons were stationed at strategic points across the region. And once direct rule began, a cohort was permanently housed in the Antonia fortress, a military stronghold built high enough to look straight down into the temple courts, so that Roman eyes could watch the most sacred space in Judaism at every festival, every gathering, every crowd large enough to become a threat. Picture that for a moment. Jewish worshippers praying and sacrificing in the temple, while armed Roman soldiers stood watch from a tower above them, ready to move at the first sign of unrest. That image alone tells you almost everything you need to know about what daily religious life felt like under occupation. Roughly 2 decades later, the Roman Senate handed the throne of Judea to a young, ambitious, politically gifted man named Herod. Herod was not a descendant of David. He was not even considered fully Jewish by many of his contemporaries, since his family came from Idumea. What made Herod valuable to Rome was not his bloodline. It was his loyalty. Herod understood something that many client kings never grasped. His power depended entirely on staying useful to Caesar. So he built obsessively, almost desperately, as if construction itself could prove his devotion. He expanded the Second Temple into one of the architectural wonders of the ancient world. He built the port city of Caesarea Maritima from nothing, complete with a Roman-style harbor, an amphitheater, and a temple dedicated to Augustus. He built fortresses in the wilderness, palaces on cliffsides, entire cities named after his patrons in Rome. And he ruled with the paranoid brutality of a man who knew his crown existed only because a foreign empire had decided to let him keep it. This is the same Herod who, according to Matthew's Gospel, responded to the news of a newborn king by ordering the deaths of infant boys in Bethlehem. It is a horrifying scene, but it is also a coherent one, once you understand the man. A client king who owed his entire existence to Roman favor could not tolerate even a whisper of a rival claimant, especially one described as a king. Herod died in 4 BC, and his kingdom was divided among his sons. None of them received his title. The son who took over Judea, Samaria, and Idumea, a man named Archelaus, ruled so badly and so violently that his own subjects eventually sent a delegation to Rome begging Augustus to remove him. In AD 6, Augustus agreed. Archelaus was banished, and Judea was absorbed directly into the Roman administrative system. This is the moment the story shifts from indirect control through a client king to direct occupation. From this point forward, Judea was governed by Roman officials sent from Rome itself, first called prefects and later procurators, men whose primary responsibilities were collecting taxes, maintaining order, and holding the power of capital punishment in their own hands. This direct rule meant one thing above all else for the average family in Judea and Galilee. It meant Rome now had a far more efficient, far more invasive way of extracting money from the population. And that brings us to something most modern readers skim right past: taxation. The Greek word used in the Gospels for the tax at the center of one of Jesus' most famous confrontations is kensos. It is a Greek transliteration of the Latin word census, and it refers to a registration used to calculate a poll tax, a tax owed simply for existing as a subject of Rome. On top of this direct tax to the emperor, there were tolls on goods moving along trade routes, customs fees at borders and bridges, market taxes, and layered on top of all of it, the religious obligations Jewish law required, including the temple tax and tithes. For a small farmer or fisherman in first-century Galilee, the weight of these combined obligations was not abstract. It shaped every decision about planting, fishing, buying, and selling. It is the invisible pressure sitting behind so many of Jesus' parables about debt, about servants who cannot pay what they owe, about workers anxious over a single day's wage. Even the fishing industry on the Sea of Galilee, the trade Peter, Andrew, James, and John all knew intimately, operated under toll booths and licensing arrangements tied to Roman administration, which is part of why a customs post sat at Capernaum in the first place, positioned exactly where fishing boats and trade caravans would pass. There is another piece of Roman machinery that most modern readers walk straight past without noticing it at all. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus tells his followers that if anyone forces them to go 1 mile, they should go with him too. That instruction sounds like a general principle of generosity, and it is, but the specific Greek verb behind forces, angario, was a technical legal term. It described a real Roman practice, inherited from the Persian imperial courier system, that gave Roman soldiers the legal right to seize local labor, animals, or supplies on demand, compelling any civilian to carry a burden for a fixed distance without pay or consent. It was a hated, humiliating feature of occupied life, and the Jewish resistance movement treated refusal to comply with it as a point of principle. Jesus took the exact word for that forced, resented labor and turned it into a picture of voluntary, radical generosity. Remember that word, because it resurfaces later in this story, at the worst possible moment, on the road to a hill outside Jerusalem. And someone had to collect all of this. That job fell to a deeply resented figure, the tax collector, called a telones in Greek. The Roman system did not send its own officials to collect every coin in every village. Instead, it auctioned off the right to collect taxes in a given region to contractors, sometimes wealthy investors known as publicani, who then hired local men, often fellow Jews, to do the actual collecting on the ground. These local collectors paid Rome a fixed amount up front, and then kept whatever they could gather above that number. You can already see the problem. The system rewarded overcharging. It built corruption directly into its structure. This is why tax collectors were not merely disliked in first-century Judea. They were treated as ritually unclean, socially poisonous, and morally compromised by association with Rome. Their testimony was not accepted in Jewish courts. They were grouped in common speech alongside sinners and prostitutes, not because every tax collector was personally wicked, but because the entire profession represented collaboration with the occupying power, profiting from your own people's subjugation. When Jesus called Levi, also known as Matthew, away from his tax booth at Capernaum, a customs post positioned along the Via Maris trade route, he was not simply calling an ordinary sinner. He was calling a man whose very livelihood marked him as a traitor in the eyes of his neighbors. And when Jesus later climbed down from a sycamore tree conversation to eat at the house of Zacchaeus, described in Luke's Gospel as a chief tax collector, a man who likely oversaw an entire district of collectors beneath him, the crowd's outrage was not confusion. It was consistent, predictable disgust. Jesus was eating with the enemy's business partner. Here is one detail worth sitting with. Many scholars point out that Matthew's profession likely required him to be fluent in record-keeping, numbers, and administrative Greek. It is not a coincidence, many argue, that the Gospel bearing his name contains some of the most carefully structured material in the New Testament, including a meticulously organized genealogy at its opening. The skill that once served Rome's tax ledgers may be the very skill God repurposed to write down the ancestry and identity of the Messiah. Now we arrive at Bethlehem, and at one of the most debated verses in the entire New Testament. Luke's Gospel opens the Nativity story with a decree from Caesar Augustus that the entire Roman world should be registered, and states that this was the first registration, taken while Quirinius was governing Syria. Historians and archaeologists have wrestled with the precise chronology here for a long time, because Josephus records a well-documented census under Quirinius, around AD 6, roughly a decade after most scholars date Herod's death and therefore Jesus' birth. Some scholars propose that Luke is describing an earlier, separate registration, distinguishing it from the more famous later census. Others suggest a translation nuance, that the phrase could be rendered to mean this registration happened before Quirinius's later governorship. The honest answer is that historians still debate the exact reconciliation of the dates. What is not in serious dispute is the underlying reality Luke is describing: registrations and enrollments tied to taxation and to Rome's need to catalog its subjects were a normal and recurring feature of imperial administration in this period. Whatever the precise date, the picture Luke paints is historically coherent. An empire orders its population counted and taxed, and ordinary people, including a pregnant woman near the end of her term, must comply, rearranging their entire lives around the paperwork demands of a government thousands of miles away in Rome. The road to Bethlehem was not a romantic journey. It was compliance with an imperial registration. This is also the environment that shaped what most first-century Jews expected from a Messiah. After centuries of foreign domination, first Babylon, then Persia, then Greece, and now Rome, the dominant hope among many in Judea was not primarily spiritual. It was political and military. They remembered the Maccabean revolt roughly 2 centuries earlier, when a Jewish rebellion had actually thrown off a foreign occupier and restored for a time national independence. Many expected the Messiah to do something similar. A warrior king, a liberator who would break Rome's grip the way the Maccabees had broken the Seleucid grip. This expectation was not fringe. It fueled repeated uprisings. When the AD 6 census was carried out, a man named Judas the Galilean led a revolt specifically against it, arguing that submitting to Roman registration and taxation was itself a betrayal of God's sole kingship over Israel. Jesus' own disciple list includes a man called Simon the Zealot, a title connected to this same resistance movement. The tension inside Jesus' inner circle between a former tax collector who had worked for the system and a zealot who wanted to violently overthrow it is, in itself, a small picture of the larger collision playing out across the entire region. That collision comes to a sharp point in one of the most tightly constructed confrontations in the Gospels. The question about paying taxes to Caesar. Religious leaders, hoping to trap Jesus, ask whether it is lawful to pay the kenzos, the imperial poll tax, to Caesar. The trap is elegant. If Jesus says yes, pay it, he alienates a population that despises Roman taxation and resents anyone who appears to endorse it. If he says no, do not pay it, he can be reported to Roman authorities as advocating tax rebellion, a charge that carried the weight of treason. Jesus asks for a denarius. The standard silver coin used to pay that very tax, worth roughly a single day's wage for an agricultural laborer. He asks a simple question: whose image in Greek eikon and whose inscription in Greek epigraphe are on this coin? The coin in circulation under Tiberius bore his portrait, along with an inscription proclaiming him the son of the divine Augustus, a claim that many devout Jews found not just politically irritating but religiously offensive, bordering on idolatry. When his questioners answer that the image and inscription belong to Caesar, Jesus responds with the now famous line, "Give back to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and to God what belongs to God." Notice something easy to miss. It is Jesus' opponents, not Jesus, who are shown carrying the coin. They are the ones who already have Caesar's currency in their pockets, inside the temple courts no less. Jesus does not answer the trap by picking a political side. He exposes the deeper question underneath it. What actually belongs to Caesar, and what belongs entirely to God? A coin stamped with an emperor's face is a very small thing to hand back, compared to a life stamped with the image of God. Roughly 1 generation after this confrontation, the man who governed Judea during the trial and execution of Jesus would nearly vanish from history, remembered only through the Gospels, the writings of Josephus, and a brief mention by the Roman historian Tacitus, until 1961, when archaeologists excavating the Roman theater at Caesarea Maritima uncovered a stone bearing a partial Latin inscription. The inscription names Pontius Pilate and identifies his title as Praefectus Judaeae, prefect of Judea, not procurator, the term later tradition often assumed. This is one of the very few pieces of physical, non-biblical contemporary evidence confirming a figure named directly in the Gospel accounts, and it settled a real historical question about his exact administrative rank. Pilate held, in Roman terms, both civil and military authority over the province, including the power of capital punishment, the power described so plainly in the Gospel trial narratives, where Jewish authorities, lacking that same authority under Roman occupation, brought Jesus before Pilate specifically because only Rome could carry out an execution, and Rome did carry it out, using its most calculated instrument of public terror. Crucifixion in the Roman world was never simply about killing someone. Death could be accomplished far more quickly by other means. Crucifixion was about display. It was, in its origins, described by ancient writers as a punishment for slaves, so closely associated with servile status that Latin sources use the phrase supplicium servile, the punishment of slaves, almost interchangeably with the act itself. Over time, its use expanded to pirates, provincial rebels, and anyone Rome wished to make an example of, almost always excluding Roman citizens, who were typically fined or exiled rather than crucified. Decades before Jesus' crucifixion, following the slave uprising led by Spartacus, Rome crucified thousands of captured rebels along the roadside leading into the capital, a visible, deliberate warning stretching for miles. Josephus records Roman soldiers crucifying so many people during the later Jewish revolt that, in his words, space was eventually lacking for the crosses and crosses for the bodies. This is the exact method chosen for Jesus. Not stoning, the traditional Jewish method of execution for religious offenses. Crucifixion, the Roman method reserved for slaves and insurrectionists, carried out publicly outside the city walls, with a sign nailed above his head announcing in 3 languages the charge against him, King of the Jews. Rome was not simply killing a man. Rome was making a public statement about what happens to anyone who threatens to wear that title without Caesar's permission. And remember that word from earlier, angario, the technical term for a Roman soldier's legal right to seize a civilian's labor without consent. All 3 synoptic Gospels use a related form of that exact word to describe how Simon of Cyrene came to carry Jesus' cross. Simon was not a volunteer. He was compelled, requisitioned, forced into the task the same way any anonymous villager might be forced to carry a soldier's pack for a mile along a Judean road. A man who almost certainly had nothing to do with the trial, who was likely just passing through the city gate at the wrong moment, was suddenly pulled into the machinery of a Roman execution simply because Roman law allowed a soldier to grab any bystander he chose. Even the detail of who carried the cross is soaked in the ordinary, grinding reality of what it meant to live under occupation. And yet, this is where the story does something almost impossible to plan. The very empire that built the machinery of taxation, occupation, and crucifixion also built, without ever intending to, the infrastructure that would carry the message of a crucified and risen Jesus to the far corners of the known world. The Apostle Paul, writing to a group of believers in Galatia, describes the timing of Jesus' birth with a striking phrase. He says that when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son. The Greek behind fullness of time is pleroma tou chrono. Pleroma carries the sense of a container filled all the way to overflowing, like a vessel so completely full it can hold no more. It is the language of ripeness, of a moment finally, fully ready, and when you look at the actual conditions of the first century, it becomes strikingly clear what that ripeness included. The Pax Romana, the relative peace enforced across the empire by Roman military dominance, meant safer roads and safer sea lanes than the ancient world had known in generations, with piracy suppressed across much of the Mediterranean. Rome's extraordinary network of roads, built originally to move legions and tax revenue efficiently, became the very roads the Apostle Paul walked and sailed near on his missionary journeys. And Koine Greek, the common trade language, spread across the Eastern Empire by centuries of Hellenistic influence and reinforced by Roman administration, meant that a letter written in Greek to a church in Galatia could be read and understood from Antioch to Rome to Corinth. The census systems, the taxation networks, the roads built for soldiers and tribute collectors, the common tongue built for commerce and control, all of it, every piece of the empire's machinery of domination became, in the hands of God, delivery infrastructure for good news the empire never intended to carry. This is worth sitting with for a long moment. God did not wait for Rome to disappear before sending his Son. He did not wait for a friendlier political climate, a kinder government, an easier world. He sent him directly into the middle of occupation, into a family that would have to register with an imperial census, into a country patrolled by soldiers, taxed by collectors, and ruled by a prefect with the legal power to execute him. And then, astonishingly, he used the very structures built to control and subjugate people as the pathway for a message about a kingdom that could never be controlled or subjugated at all. So here is where this actually lands for you, right now. Maybe you are not living under a Roman prefect or paying a kenzos to a distant emperor, but you know what it feels like to live inside a system you did not choose and cannot fully control. A workplace with rules you did not write. An economy that takes more than it seems to give back. A diagnosis, a bill, a bureaucracy. A set of circumstances that showed up in your life the way Roman rule showed up in Judea. Uninvited, immovable, and indifferent to whether you consent. Maybe it is a family situation you were born into and never chose. Maybe it is a body that does not cooperate, a job that does not fill you, a season that simply refuses to move at the pace you were hoping for. It is tempting to believe that faith only makes sense once the empire is gone, once the pressure lifts, once your circumstances finally feel fair. It is tempting to think that God is waiting somewhere out beyond your current situation, and that real life, real faith, real peace will only begin once the obstacle is removed. But the story of Jesus insists on something harder and, in the end, far more hopeful. God's kingdom did not wait for Rome to fall.